me. Just had no idea the impact it would have, and that's. I went under Thurman initially, who was then the desk personnel. He was a 3-star at that time. And then the stuff we were doing was getting darker, and so that's when I moved over to INSCOM under Stubblebine.
I would like to rewind for just a minute.
Okay.
So let's go back to, you wrote the article about remote viewing, out-of-body experiences. It got published. What is it that led you to write that article? Because that sounds like a very important turning point in your career.
Oh, no, no, by this time I had been interested in phenomena of various sort. And one of the biggies was, in, quote, the Bermuda Triangle, and there was an area out there that had dived on what we think is pre-cataclysmic civilizations, and so I had personal interest. And when I was in Hawaii, had done a number of talks and met with people, and I was getting more actively involved. Some of the things, you go back even further. Yeah, in Thailand, I had gone out and met with, their version of psychics. Also, in Vietnam, physically inside my camp was a Buddhist monastery. My main interpreter had been a Buddhist monk for 6 years. And so these are areas where we were, talking on, kind of extensively. So these kinds of things had led up to, like I say, writing the article.
Is there anything specific that was a profound experience?
No.
Nothing?
No.
It was all talking to...
no epiphany.
Okay.
It was just kind of generic, more and more and more. The synchronicities keep happening, being in the right place at the right time and hearing about stories. Now, huge things had happened by the time I was at, I think a sequence, 1980. So had become interested in near-death experiences. Trying to think of the sequence on this. I had done a master's, and I was getting ready I was working on a doctorate degree at the time. I was getting ready to grind out a dissertation, because that's what you've got to do. And this was one of these, this is kind of a huge shift in thought here, but it's coincidental, because I was back at, now in Atlanta, Fort McPherson, and I went to a lecture by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which was kind of interesting. And from that, I went to a life, death, and transition workshop that she was doing. And that was unique. I was just on leave. Military hadn't sent me there. But about half of the people who attended were medical of some kind, nurses, doctors, etc., interested in what she's talking about. And a quarter of people were, like me, just kind of generically interested. The other quarter were dying. So, you talk about an emotionally charged experience. That was at my roommate at where we were staying there. I forget, it was in Midline Granuloma, but he had literally, his face was being eaten off, and and going to be terminal, and knew it, and a lot of the people were like that. So that was really powerful. So I came back, and I was at McPherson, and I just sent Elizabeth a letter and said, "Gee, that was really powerful. Thank you." Blah, blah. So I'm in the office. About a couple of months later, the phone rings, and it's Elizabeth's secretary, and she says, "Now I'm getting ready to go to physically do the dissertation." And she says, "Look, Elizabeth is going to be in Atlanta tomorrow. Can you meet her?" She's got a few hours between flights. This was in the days where you could, go out to the gate and all that. I said, well, yeah, sure. So anyway, she flies in, and I meet her, and she says, I probably know 1,000 people in Atlanta, and I chose you to call, and I have no idea why. I said, I think I'm supposed to ask you a question. Would you do the committee? She says, oh, yes. So, like I said, you cannot program those kinds of things. The rest sort of is history, but that was a piece because, see, she and Raymond Moody, who was the one who kind of wrote Life After Life and was talking about near-death experiences and that. In the meantime, when I'm in IG, I had met, we were doing teaching courses at Command and General Staff College, and I was introduced to a guy. This gets into the really weird stuff, but this was one of the most impactful near-death cases because it goes back to Vietnam. And what had happened, Jim, they were flying on Cobras, how the Cobras lined up, you have front seat and the back seat. He's front seat. And they're out alone, and normally you fly, snakes went in pairs. You didn't fly alone. Well, they were flying alone and went out over this forested area, and all of a sudden the 51 opens up on him, hits thing, and breaks his leg. Even the chick is there, and cuts the controls between the front seat and the back seat. And there's nothing in the area. There's a tiny area, but it's not big enough to auto-rotate into. So what they do is, he says he pulls the nose up. Now, Jim says he pulls the nose up. Now, the point here is we know the controls had been shot away between the front seat and the back seat, but he still brought the plane up. And the reason was to come in boom first. This was not going to be good, but it was to absorb the shock and ameliorate the shock as you're coming down. The other important aspect is you don't know the orientation of the helicopter because the blade's turning until after it's beaten itself to death on the ground. So it does that. And Jim says the thing started, literally his face is burned off. The pilot, the area had caught fire. Very bad day. So not only broken leg, face is burned. So they hit, and next thing he knows, he's out of his body up above, and he can see the orientation of the helicopter. This is what gets critical. And he can see that the way it's lined up off the nose, about a click and a half out in front, is a friendly fire support base. Jungle all around them, other than that. But you have to have had the position from above to look down to see the orientation. So the back seat is out, and he's running away. The canopies went this way. And he looks back, and about that time, Jim looks up. Oh, in the meantime, he's out of his body. He sees that, and there's a hooded figure. Describes as male, and not sure why. And he says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Well, I'm trying to help them. Not I'm in trouble or something." He says, "I'm trying to help them." And he says, "What, don't you know?" He says, "No, what? You're not dead yet." And with that, he lifts up. Back seat is running away and sees Jim move, so he runs back and grabs him out and says, "I thought you were dead. You haven't moved, since we were hit." A lot of other stuff happened, but they get into an argument about there's a fire support base, and the pilot's saying it's off this direction, and Jim is saying, no, it's off this direction. And pain is now setting in, and he's not in a position to argue, and so he hides behind some higher big anthills that are in the area. And about this time, VC's coming after them. And so the guy goes off in this direction. Jim Hides, he'd actually decided to commit suicide if he was captured because he knew wounded prisoners were not going to be treated well. But they miss him. A friendly base comes in, sends people out. They saw the crash and they send somebody out. So now they come in with a jungle penetrator. And this is the only case that I've had in this. So he's lifted up. So he's now physically replicating his out-of-the-body position. And he can see the orientation of the helicopter, relative position to the fire support base, and say, this guy's lost. And was able to, before he passes out, say, by the way, the pilot went out over here, and they went out and found him.
Whoa. Wow.
But like I say, it's the only case I have where you have, from an out-of-body perspective, and then physically replicate it and find out, now it's accurate.
Have you ever heard of that since then, or this is the only time you've heard
like I say, I know, well, later, again, I guess when I was in IG, no, it was after I joined INSCOM that I became the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. So I heard lots and lots of cases, and we can get into some of those. But there are people who have had things that have been authenticated that they saw, but never one where they physically get taken up and see it, and it becomes life-saving.
Wow. I could see how that would capture your interest to write that article.
Yeah.
So moving forward again, you write the article, General removes you from the unit and puts you in INSCOM. What does INSCOM stand for?
Oh, Intelligence and Security Command.
What was your position at INSCOM?
Well, we called it the Chief of Human Technology. He created the position. People used to ask what I do, and I said, well, I'm a freelance colonel.
Chief of Human Technology. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we were looking at, and this is where we get into other aspects. You talked to Joe, the remote viewing program is going. Stubblebine is very interested. Funding is an issue that's pretty significant here because it was a time when you had a fair amount of funding that, could be used. It's still true to some area, but discretional funding, we didn't have to. And Bert was interested. And there's an important figure by the name of Jack Houck who comes into this. And Jack is at McDonnell Douglas at the time. And he had watched Uri Geller and had come up with the, quote, spoon bending process that is now popular. And so some friends, he used to come to Washington because he was also a CEO, did contract work for CIA. And so he was back and forth in Washington, so we heard about this, and he was just starting, he's got to be 82, just starting the spoon bending thing. And what he had found is that this was a teachable skill. And he had based it on the stuff that Geller was doing. But he was having parties and would invite groups of people in. And we heard about that. We had one. So that's kind of, I told Stubblebine about it. And he said, well, let's see if we can do that. So I got a hold of Jack and invited him to, I was then in an apartment high-rise in Washington, Northern Virginia area. And we have PK party. So we're sitting kind of on the floor, looking around in more or less a semicircle. And there were some significant people there. People know the history. Andrea Poharic was there. I don't know if you know him, but this goes back into World War II, where he was interested and had worked with the agency. And I mean, these are heavy hitters in the psi phenomenon R&D area. And so Bert's sitting there, much like we are now, and there was a medium who was there. Another one of the key people had been Rickover's technical director, and who knew the medium and brought her. But anyway, the way it works is you go through an hour or so, and some of the stuff's physical, so it's hard to say whether that has any significance. But the graduate session, you end up holding two forks like this that are matched and no physical force. And so she's sitting directly across from Bert, and her thing goes, bloop,
No way.
with no physical force. That's when we went, oh shit.
You saw this.
This is real, yeah. Oh, I've had later experiences, but I learned how to teach it and ran these things for a while. But it was this thing, like I say, in front of the commander, just drops a full 90 degrees with no physical force. Said, need to look at this. So started doing serious studies and then, see, we would have love-ins. We had 06 commands around the world. And so every quarter, the commanders would come in and discuss what are you going to do, what's going forward, what's happening literally in the world at the time. Remember, this is the bad old days. We're still talking Soviet Union. And so he was very interested so I ended up running sessions for them, which was not always appreciated by the folks that was interested. But the point, because I asked you a question, is what are you going to do, bend tank barrels? And you go, no, computers. And remember, computers are just can move the thing about moving electrons. And the key issue there is I don't have to destroy, I just have to make computers unreliable. A lot of stuff there. But anyway, the big lesson that Bert wanted to get in, it really didn't have to do with the psychokinesis. It had to do with don't eliminate things just because you don't understand it. See, we had been blindsided by the Soviets several times. Sputnik, for instance, was one. And there were several others. Joe, did he talk about the submarine?
Yes, he did.
I mean, that was one that was oh, wow. And the point was we had all the information, and our boat builders said, don't believe it. We never heard if it would go to depth, anything that big would crush, et cetera, et cetera. And we didn't have any word at the time of a radically different Soviet subsystem. And as you know from the thing, it came out and he had laid out, the tubes are forward of the sail and that sort of thing. So our point was that had happened to us on several occasions, and when you look back, you found out you had the information, but it had been disregarded. So the idea to these colonels was, don't just disregard something because you don't do it, because you've now had personal experience with things that happened that you didn't think could happen. And so that was one of the emphases that...
What was that like for you to be in that room when that spoon hit 90? I mean, that was
a no shit moment. That was because I had seen a little bit of bending before, but nothing that dramatic. Now I've seen even more dramatic since. There was one of these where love-ins we were doing at the Xerox Center. This is one where I can't send you I have the forks on it. But same thing, we're in a semicircle and I'm doing it and there's grumbling. I mean, basically there were people who didn't like the stuff going on. And it happened to be a lieutenant colonel who was a liaison from Europe who was in the session and holds it up and same thing, the thing drops a full 90 degrees and they scream. And I'm going, but I did not see that. But I have a GS-18, the science advisor behind does. And so we're looking, and there was the guy next to him that yelled, and this thing just fell over. But then with everybody watching, it came back up, went down, came about halfway back up and stopped. I mean, literally waved. Now, that's the N of 1. I've only seen that happen one time, but it was really significant. Had some other pretty good bending that happened that night, but absolutely no physical force and this thing moving, on its own. Now, I said, I have them. The reason he put that down, and he said, I wish that hadn't happened. Scared him. Normally, we let people take the stuff home with them. And it scared him so badly that he just left it. And I still have those forks.
You still
Now, I
have them?
understand he went back to Europe. He was American, but, lays on there, and did it once more and just said, enough, don't want to do that again. Scared him. But fortunately, at the time, the initial incident, we had our shrink with us. We had to put him back together before we sent him home because it was that big a deal.
Yeah. Wow. What, I have a handful of things that you guys were studying, it seems. I have a handful of things that you guys were studying at INSCOM, and one of them is the Hutchinson effect. Can you describe the Hutchinson effect?
Not effectively. John Hutchison, there's a video, I don't have the tape of it. What had happened was George Hathaway, who's a double E from Toronto, and another guy came in, and they had a movie of these events happening, and the problem is not a single thing. Stuff would levitate. I mean, heavy items would levitate. Things would disintegrate. There was one photo, they had 2 pieces of wood with a rat tail file in between it, and it's just being exposed to this field effect. And you see the thing look like a filament on a light, back in the old filament days there, and you see it light up, burn, and drop. It literally burns in 2. More exciting, pick it up after and it's cold. And, again, these are things that can't, and there are any number of effects. John Hutchison is alive and well and now in California.
On the subatomic level, I feel that there is a dimension shift activated by very conventional electrostatics, RF fields that I use, and Tesla waves that I use, that actually form a keyway that opens up another area of time and space that may activate the zero-point energy fields and interdimensional reactions, let's say, to gravitational waves and time waves, or chronons, if you wish. Perhaps we're dealing in chronons and gravitons, which are maybe particles.
At that time, he was in Vancouver, and I put him under contract to replicate things. And the big problem, like with many of these phenomena, control still doesn't have it. Lots of strange things happen, but you can't control the event. They had others with PVC exposed, and the PVC disintegrate, parts of it disintegrate. He had a drive shaft. By the way, the guy was a pauper. I mean, had no money, no money. But he was interested in Tesla. So what he would do is he would look at pictures of Nikola Tesla and try to figure out what they were doing. The only saving grace, because he had all this crap that was in there, was just. And fortunately, Hathaway went in and actually kept records of what this was, but still couldn't control the thing. But, you had metal. Again, it's just exposed to a field that would twist and burn, and some stuff would be affected, others wouldn't. And it just totally, to this day, pretty much uncontrolled, though he's doing it. This is one, and I'll digress, but I think ought to be in there. We now have, the Army has something called the Future Command that is looking at what's the war going to look like, be very different. And I got in touch with them. I actually sent a letter to the commanding general. We did a number of these things. Think somebody ought to take a look. I had no thinking that the 4-star general would get it, but I thought it would go to the staff or something. I have not even heard a peep out of them. I tried some, we don't understand this stuff, but, here's the roads we've been down. Wouldn't somebody be willing to take a look? Abject silence. With Hutchison, well, what happened was I had provided him with enough funding to move this thing. Well, the problem was he was living in a housing complex in Vancouver, and he would do this stuff. And what he would do is, by the way, how we found it is kind of interesting. What he wanted to do is to make sparks. He literally had Van de Graaff generators and things like that because he liked to sit there and sparks. The way he found it, threw something in, and this thing came flying out. And he picks it up and throws it back in, and it comes flying out. And you're going like, what's this? Well, the real problem was that he was working in the basement of an area. We think that the piping was probably part of it, but he was screwing up everybody's TV in the area. So they did not like that. So made him move. It's not cable TV like you think of today. This was the stuff that went through the air at the time. So I got a hold of a guy, and he and George were working with him. And we said, okay, we're going to pay you to replicate this event. Okay, so they're in a warehouse that's totally empty, and you can get all the way around it. And what I did is I gave them a bunch of metal. I had various metal samples and had cut them in half. I was operating out of Fort Belvoir at the time. So half of the metal is in a safe at Belvoir, and the other half that I sent to them. So we agreed to have show and tell. And I have a team of scientists, 2 of them from Los Alamos, and promise not to denigrate anybody. But anyway, I had 4 others, including myself. So we go to show. So I arrive a day early. Just want to make sure things are working. And they're really excited. Hey, we had this thing levitating. And so all we did was turn it off, leave everything settings. The idea was tomorrow we'll turn it back on and everything's right in place. Even if it's unusual, it'll happen. They come in, we turn it on, and damned if the power supply doesn't catch fire and burn up on the spot. And it turns out there was so we spent the rest of the day, they were trying to find another power supply to it. The bottom line is nothing happened during that. Now, in the meantime, Jack Houck again had given me some molybdenum rods. And the point was that molybdenum was treated differently and had never had success with anybody trying to bend it. And I had given them rods, and I had some parallel ones. Damned if they didn't give me one back with an S-curve in it. How that happened, don't know. Interestingly, one of the questions was, were we looking at psychokinetic effects? Because I had asked John, are you part of the system? And he would say, yes. I get excited and it bends. But when I asked George about it, he says, no, it bends or whatever happens, happens. And then he gets excited. So whether this is a macro PK event or whatnot, don't know. But there was certainly a series of very unusual things that were happening and still happen. Since nothing happened in our experiments, we went back, and damned if one of the two guys from Los Alamos didn't write this really nasty. I don't know if you know Tom Bearden or not, but he had a whole thing about how Tom had slipped into the country and done this, and it was just terribly convoluted. I mean, all he had to say was, we came, we saw, nothing happened, anything. Instead, it's this very nasty gram, and, so yeah, we couldn't go forward, but Jack did get funding and do it, but similar sorts of things. The stuff would happen just outside the camera range and that. But it's almost like the ranch. Strange things happen and you really can't explain it.
What year is this?
Well, mine is going to be 82, maybe 83. I'm still in touch with him, though. That's why I know he's got a lab in Northern California, but has a lot of health problems, but is still continuing and gets, the news come in and wow, and it's wonderful, but nobody has been able to, establish the parameters and have it on a replicable basis.
How long, so you get moved into INSCOM, and how long was it before you started seeing metal bending, levitation, departicle, departicleization?
I can't give you the exact time, but
is this all happening at once?
I'd have to go back and look because it depends on when it was all predicated on Jack coming to town and, they say, doing the first one, and then the one that I set up with Stubblebine, and Ann Gaiman is the one who had the thing drop on us. And it's about the same time because I'm still working with ions, totally civilian side. This is near-death studies. Just remember driving up there and stuff being bent. In fact, the next one we actually had was the ions board going like, wow.